Hi, my name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to the NegReg Rundown, which is a bit of a variation on our typical series, the Higher Ed Reg Rundown. And the idea here is that we are going to be doing some debrief sessions following each week of the ongoing negotiated rulemakings being held by the U.S. Department of Education. This week, we're talking about the RISE Committee, and this is your week one debrief. In case you don't know us, Thompson Coburn LLP is a law firm. We have a little over 400 attorneys spread throughout the country in major markets. We have a higher education practice, which is a group of attorneys that spend all or most of our time serving institutions of higher education. And as previously mentioned, this is the NegReg Rundown. And the idea here is to give you a concise debrief, hit on the major themes at least of recent negotiated rulemaking action. As I mentioned, I'm Aaron Lacey, and I'm joined today by three of my colleagues, and here they are. And you can see we specifically included their names on the screens. We've got Katie Wendell, Hope Watson, and last but not least, Scott Goldschmidt. Katie, Hope, and Scott are all sitting in our Washington, D.C. office. I actually am out in our St. Louis headquarters. And I bring that up because they were all in the room at NegReg last week at one point or another. And that's why I wanted to invite them here today so they could give you the scoop as folks who were there and heard it firsthand. Again, we're talking about the RISE committee. There are a couple of rulemakings ongoing right now, and we anticipate that there will be more in the near future that are announced. But the RISE, or Reimagining and Improving Student Education Committee, just held its first week of negotiations. You see that was September 29th through October 3rd. They have a second week of negotiations, and that's a 5 full days that is scheduled for November 3rd through November 7th. Historically, there have often been 3 weeks of negotiated rulemaking that take place for each committee, but this administration seems to be pursuing a slightly different strategy. It has 2 weeks, but each of those weeks is 5 days instead of four. So we're sort of between the 2 weeks of negotiation. The RISE committee is handling a range of topics, but most of those are designed to implement changes that were brought about by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We'll be referring to it as the OB3. For the RISE committee, that includes the phase out of graduate and professional plus loans, that program, establishment of new annual loan limits and lifetime borrowing caps, simplification of student loan repayment plans. Right now, there are multiple plans, and part of what OB3 did was to sort of drive this simplification of all of those into two primary plans in the coming years, modifications to loan rehabilitation, and other various topics. The committee's composition, just so you know, and there is some sense to the color coding here on your screen. There are essentially three constituents represented here, or individuals at the table that represent students or consumers in this context, in the context of higher education. There are essentially three negotiators representing institutions, that's in green. There is one regulator at the table, and then there are a couple of what I'll call, I don't know, wild card may be the wrong word, but folks who are not in one of those other three buckets, right? And here you've got student loan servicers and guarantee agencies and organizations representing taxpayers and the public interest. It's a smaller committee, right? You really only have 9 people here sometimes, and you'll see this with the head committee that we expect to see seated later this year, a larger round of our group of people at the table. But here, this is your current constituency. And if you want to learn more about negotiated rulemaking, by the way, if you want to follow the action, if you want to register and go sit in the room in DC, you can do that. You can follow all of that at the department's website. Of course, one caveat, we are recording this in the midst of a government shutdown, but the committee did finish its business last week, notwithstanding the shutdown, and our expectation is that unless this becomes a really protracted shutdown, that we will see these committee activities start back up in November as scheduled. We have three themes we want to hit on today for you. We're not going to do soup to nuts, everything that was discussed in NegReg. Instead, what we're really trying to do is to sort of distill and draw out the big themes that we think are important for you all to hear about and be thoughtful about as you look forward towards the next second week of negotiations for this RISE committee. And here are our three themes on the screen. The first is the master calendar question. The second is, What's a professional degree program? I really thought about doing that Jeopardy style. What is a professional degree for 1,000? And then finally, you can move the needle, and we're going to split these up among all three of the folks that you see on your screen. And we'll start the master calendar question. And Katie Wendell, I will throw it to you. So tell us what they talked about last week and what we mean by this.
Okay, thanks, Aaron, and hi, everyone. Before we jump into OB3, I think it's important to understand that any Title IV regulations that the U.S. Department of Education enacts are subject to what's called the Master Calendar, which is described in the Higher Education Act. The Master Calendar lays out deadlines related to the delivery of Title IV funds to students, but it also says that any regulation that the department enacts must be published in final form no later than November 1st in any given year to become effective July 1st of the next year. So, in other words, if the department publishes new final rules on December 15th of 2025, according to the master calendar, those specific rules could not be effective until July 1 of 2027 because they would have missed that November 1st deadline that's set in the master calendar rule. With OB3, Congress has drafted laws that in some cases are set to become effective July 1, 2026. In order for the department to put regulations in place to carry out those laws, according to the master calendar, they would need to be in final form by November 1, 2025. So just in a few short weeks. Beyond having the rules in final form, there are other steps required to finalize a regulation, including this negotiated rulemaking process that we're discussing today. The department also has to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking to the Federal Register once NegReg is done. There has to be a public comment period, and then the department has to finalize and issue that final rule. None of those steps are quick, and I think it was clear at NegReg in the room that everyone understood there was no way a final rule would come out of this current process by November 1 to align with the master calendar requirements. So initially at Monday's NegReg session, the department indicated that the secretary had waived the master calendar requirement in this case. However, the department's counsel quickly jumped in and noted that the secretary did not waive the requirement. Instead, their interpretation is that Congress set certain dates in the legislative text. So they have implicitly waived the master calendar requirement that's in the HEA. Then the department laid out its planned timeline. They plan to publish the proposed rule at the end of this year, so by December 31st, 2025. And then after the public comment period, get to a final rule by the spring of 2026. So if that becomes true, institutions will ostensibly just have a few months to prepare for that July 1, 2026 effective date of those rules. I would say the jury is still out on this timeline and that it might raise some eyebrows from a legal perspective. For one thing, the master calendar is a specific and explicit framework that exists in statute. The department here is saying that non-specific implicit language from Congress should override that specific and explicit language, which doesn't always hold water when you talk about statutory interpretation. Congress could have chosen to include language allowing for this override of the master calendar, but they didn't. That is something that the department is implying from OB3. So that's interesting. It's unclear. That might be something that's ripe for litigation. The other piece is that Congress has directed the department to do specific things by specific dates in OB3. And there are regulations that the department will have to put in place to make that implementation work. They're required. But then there are also things we believe the department might want to do as part of that implementation, even if they are not absolutely necessary under the language of OB3. maybe that list of items is related to the statutory language, but not absolutely required under the language that Congress included in OB3. I think this could become another problematic gray area for the department because we have to ask if there is even further implicit allowance in Congress's language or intent that the department could implement things related to their statutory language outside of the master calendar. So I think this is pretty interesting, and there are some unresolved questions thrown in there with some pretty tricky legal concepts.
Thank you so much. Yeah, totally agree. But thank you for just that's a complicated concept. So I appreciate how clearly you set that out. A great deal. Um, Scott, something that is also sort of murky and was a major theme of this week's negotiated rulemaking, and that's this question around professional degree. And I'll offer just a couple of slides here of background for our viewers to set this up, and then turn it over to Scott, who again was in the room and can do a much better job of explaining what actually occurred. But just to set the backdrop here, so when OB3 was created this past summer, one of the things that the department did was they created new loan limits for graduate and professional students, and they drew a distinction between what those loan limits would be for students in graduate programs and students in professional degree programs. And what you can see on your screen, and there's a lot of detail here, you don't have to go into all of it, but the key idea here is those loan limits aren't the same, right? For graduate students, the aggregate loan limit's $100,000. For professional students, the aggregate loan limit is up to $200,000. So this distinction between what's a graduate program and a professional degree program, which historically has not had a lot of significance, has suddenly become extremely significant because students in one type obviously have the ability potentially to access twice as much in terms of loans. Now, Congress specifically pointed to this definition of professional degree that already exists in the regulations, and you can see that here on your screen as well. And I'll just highlight before turning it over to the Scott. I like that. I mean, it's like the Ohio State. We're going to start calling
Right.
you the Scott. Before turning it over to the Scott,
Mm.
you'll see the definition. The first couple of pieces of it are qualitative. So it says we're talking about when we talk about a professional degree, a degree that signifies both completion of the academic requirements for beginning practice in a given profession and a level of professional skill beyond that normally required for a bachelor's degree. Then there's this second sentence, professional licensure is also generally required. And then there's a third sentence that says examples of professional degree include, but are not limited to, and then we have this list of examples. Uh, with that, Scott, I'll turn over to you to talk about why this became such an interesting discussion point this week during NegReg.
Absolutely. And thanks, Aaron. And pleasure to be here and kind of share what I learned at NegReg. But right, this is a significant issue for institutions, as Aaron mentioned, based on the loan limits for each one. And after OB3 was passed, many institutions began reconsidering that designation of programs as either graduate or professional. Negotiators came into this NegReg anticipating a robust debate. This was one of the hot ticket items of this NegReg. But on day one, the department opened the issue by stating it had no discretion to expand the list of degrees beyond those explicitly named in regulation, as Aaron pointed out. And any additions to that list would require a future rulemaking, which the department was very clear that they said was not planned anytime in the near term. This stance was unexpected and caused real concern among negotiators and the audience, and led negotiators and constituencies and audience members to quickly begin voicing their concerns to the department. So that was an eventful day one. Day two, the department reinforced its position by circulating revised regulatory language and posted that online that made it even clearer that only the degrees listed on the slide Aaron pointed out qualify as professional degrees. So by day three, the department, in response to concerns from negotiators, constituencies, the audience, introduced an interim definition of professional student through June 30th, 2027. So under this proposal from the department, and again, not final, just still a proposed language to negotiate, students could be treated as professional if they enrolled before July 2027 in a program that one, awards a professional degree upon completion, two, existed as of July 4th, 2025, the date OB3 was signed, three, received Title IV funds in 2024-2025, and four, was designated by the institution as professional. Now, the department framed this interim definition as a way to kind of maintain the status quo temporarily. But in the room, not everyone was totally on board. Some of the comments, for example, a negotiator representing taxpayers and the public interest questioned whether that undermined Congress's intent to limit borrowing in OB3. Other negotiators questioned whether the department even had the authority to impose such an interim definition, what OMB would say about it. And so the week of NegReg ended with unanswered questions about the definition and the regulatory language. It's important to note that the department noted the negotiators had drafted alternative language for consideration. Typically, those materials are posted on the department's website and provide insight into negotiators' thinking, but they were not posted because of the shutdown, so we don't have that information right now. When the shutdown is lifted, hopefully that will be posted. But bottom line is that the department's interpretation, coupled with its interim compromise, has not solved the issue. It remains unsettled and will assuredly be a focal point in the next round of negotiations.
And Scott, just to be very clear, even as of Wednesday, when the department, so they created this interim definition that presumably would allow some additional programs some opportunity to access those higher loan limits during this period. It's still the department's stance. It sounds like even as of Wednesday close of business, that following that interim period for the foreseeable future, they still want to limit the universe of professional degrees to what is in the current regulatory text. Is that right? I just want to make sure I understand that correctly.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So that's the new kind of first part of the definition, and what follows are the list of enumerated programs still in the regulation. There is a position that the department conceded that a future NegReg could expand that list, but for now, based on OB3 and their interpretation, right, this interim definition is just meant to kind of temporarily bridge the gap for institutions that might not be expecting this and students that might not be expecting these loan limitations in the near future, and then kind of get to the meat of their interpretation, exactly as you referenced.
And I'll just add here as we close. First of all, thank you, Scott, for that hot issue. We'll be very interested in hearing how things sort of land after week two and getting your feedback there. Just a couple of points. I mean, the first is when you talk about these professional degree programs and this distinction between professional and grad degree program, I think schools are going to have to continue to pay a lot of attention and tread a little bit of water for the moment to see how NegReg pans out, but it obviously is really extremely significant, and we think it is appropriate for institutions to be paying very close attention and sort of going through this deliberation. The one other thing I just wanted to mention, Scott was talking about regulations and texts that are being considered by the negotiators. And I just want to draw a distinction because sometimes this can be confusing. So the language right now that folks are looking at, meaning around the table, the department is literally sometimes throwing text that they'll either give a handout in advance or they'll throw something up on a projector in real time. I'll refer to this as draft language, right? And then once you get to the end of the negotiated rulemaking process, the department will actually issue a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. That is proposed regulatory text. That's actually a proposed rule, and folks can comment on that. Sometimes this distinction between draft and proposed gets a little blurry, and you'll hear folks right now, even in the context of NegReg, talking about this proposed rule or that proposed rule. But just to be really clear, while we're talking about NegReg, we're talking about draft language that the department is putting out there for the negotiators' consideration. And it will not be until NegReg is completed and the department actually puts something out for public comment in the Federal Register. That is what we would call a proposed rule. So an easy way, at least I in my world, draw that distinction is I'll call one draft text and then I'll call the other the proposed rule. But I just don't want folks listening to this to be confused. There is not presently a proposed rule on this topic. We're just talking about draft language the department has been offering up in the context of negotiated rulemaking for folks to consider. Okay, so that brings us, Hope Watson, to you and our final sort of theme here. And that is, we've put it under the heading of you can move the needle. It's very positive. It reminds me
Yes.
of the Olympics. You can do it. So tell us
Yeah.
what we mean. Why was this a theme this week in NegReg?
Absolutely. Ending on a high note. And, as Scott mentioned with the professional degree discussion, the department started in one position and took in feedback from negotiators, interested parties that were supporting negotiators, the regulated community that was providing feedback to the negotiators. And over the course of that week, in response to that feedback, took an evolving position. Of course, as Scott laid out, that position is not in any way final, and we expect to hear more in this upcoming session in November. But it demonstrates that your voice matters throughout the process and that each day of these sessions are iterative, and the draft language that the department introduces is just that. It's a draft and it evolves over the course of these sessions. It's not uncommon for the department to present draft language in the morning and to take in feedback from the negotiators over the course of that morning session to work through lunch. And then, as soon as the afternoon session, provide a revised version of that draft language for discussion. So it just demonstrates how responsive the department can be to the input that they're receiving from negotiators and the regulated community through those negotiators. So we want to highlight a few impact opportunities that you have throughout the rulemaking process, including impact opportunities you have during the negotiated rulemaking sessions. And you'll see on your screen that these are sort of laid out chronologically as the rulemaking process unfolds. So beginning with sort of the preliminary phase before negotiated rulemaking even begins, as a prelude, there is often an opportunity to attend or comment at public hearings or to schedule a listening session with the department. This was a common practice of the former administration, and under this administration, when they have time, they seem to be offering these sessions. So keep an eye out for those opportunities. We also wanted to note that trade associations tend to be heavily involved in these processes and have sort of infrastructure in place for supporting negotiations. So that can be a good entry point if you have an opportunity to coordinate with trade associations. You can also participate in public meetings, and you can nominate others to serve as a negotiator who may represent your interests well. You can serve as a negotiator yourself. We've already kind of touched on the idea of supporting negotiators, and what that can look like in a practical sense is arming negotiators with specific anecdotes, with statistics, with novel solutions that are going to really come to bear on the department's interpretations and potentially impact that draft language. There are things that the department may conceive of in theory, but don't take into consideration the practical impact. And so having those anecdotes, those statistics, those real world experiences of how that draft language will actually impact schools and students is very valuable. And to that same point, once these proposed rules are published as a result of the negotiated rulemaking discussions, uh, we have an opportunity as a regulated community to provide comment on those proposed rules. And the more specific you can be in your comments, the better. Those are the kinds of things that the department really considers as they are reviewing those comments and formulating the final rule. Once we have the final rule and it's under evaluation by the Office of Management and Budget, there is another entry point under Executive Order 12866, where you can schedule a meeting as an interested party to discuss with OMB the rule that is under review. And finally, as a last resort, we all hope that litigation doesn't become necessary. Both the department hopes that and the regulated community, but that is always an option if eventually a final rule comes to fruition that doesn't align with your needs, with your perspectives. A challenge is always on the table.
Yeah, excellent. And first of all, thank you so much for that, Hope. And I'll just reemphasize the point Hope made. Please, I mean, it's so important to be engaged. You can move the needle, and please never assume that the department has all the data and understands all the issues that you see, because we know that they do not. And they've told us over the years, we don't. I mean, they're just a group of people sitting in a room. They have a lot of knowledge and access to a lot of data, but they do not have the type of insight and experience that the entire higher education community has. So just please keep in mind, if you're seeing something or you appreciate that there's some proposal that's going to be problematic or for some reason won't work, it may be really important that you reach out and let the department know. And we have absolutely seen concrete examples where the community has provided that type of feedback and the department has moved the needle. On a last note here, we're showing you our conditions of use and disclaimer, and we'll just say, as a reminder, we are not your attorneys, unless we happen to be your attorneys, in which case, thank you for the opportunity to serve you. Thank you for all you do as a higher education community and all the students you serve. We appreciate you very much. And until next time, from the Thompson Coburn team and the Scott, we'll say, be well.